Archivides, Archivides, Kalokerinos, Kalokerinos,
Thank you.
commonly called Archie.
Okay, you've got my monitor up too high. And I've got a lot of, listen. Oh, this is like way high.
Well, I'm just hanging there, I'm making adjustments. Let's just get started here. I would move the shotgun back where I had. Let me adjust.
Yeah, talk to me, Archie, for a minute. What did you have for breakfast this morning?
We had porridge and some fruit, a cup of tea, and that's all I was allowed to have.
Well, I don't even know why you're worried about lunch. It won't be worth it anyway.
Okay, there's two. Listen, there's one. I'll switch it back and forth. This is the shotgun.
And this is that.
Yeah.
Okay, talk to me a little bit more. So, what would you like to have for lunch?
Now that's a very hard question.
There's so many options.
Or mangoes.
Mangoes are possible. Aren't they?
Yeah, we'd have to go get them though.
We'd have to go get them.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds really good, Bill. The shotgun seems, it seems noisy.
Is it all the hard surfaces in here?
There's an
Okay,
aeroplane.
let me show you.
Archie, give us a brief biography about what you've been doing these last 70-some years, or 60-some, or wherever it is.
Well, I graduated from the University of Sydney and have degrees in medicine and surgery. I'm one of 4 brothers that graduated in medicine. I worked for 2 years in Australian hospitals and 6 years in English hospitals. Then in 1957 returned to Australia and commenced a medical practice in a town called Kalokerinos, which is 500 miles northwest of Sydney, virtually in the middle of nowhere. And I was the only doctor in this huge area. Before I left Sydney, my mother's next door neighbour told me that she had been a nurse at the Kalokerinos hospital. And she told me that I would lose a lot of babies there. I thought she was crazy because I knew everything about medicine. I knew everything about babies. And I wouldn't lose any children. But I did. I lost a lot. In that tiny town of Kalokerinos, where there were perhaps 750 people in the town, another 200 Aborigines camped just on the edge of the town. And depending on where you drew the line around the district, maybe another 500 or so people in the surrounding areas. I lost 3 European babies in one 24-hour period. Aboriginal babies died just like flies. But these deaths were unusual. Some could be classified as a sudden infant death syndrome, according to the criteria of the time. They'd be found dead in their cribs, and I would do autopsies and find virtually nothing. Some babies went into a strange state of shock from which they could not be resuscitated, and they would die, and once again the autopsies would show nothing. Others suddenly became unconscious. They would die, autopsies, nothing. Others were excessively irritable, sometimes to the extent where it was possible that they had meningitis. But tests showed that they didn't have meningitis. And they would die. And autopsies, other tests would show nothing. When I reviewed the statistics, which was easy to do because the courthouse kept all the records of births, deaths and marriages, and counted up the number of babies that were born in a year, and then counted up the numbers that died in these strange ways, it appeared that Kalokerinos had the highest infant mortality rate in the world. And this included figures that I got from Africa and rural India. I couldn't believe it. So I toured around this vast area and spoke to every doctor within perhaps 300 miles. They all denied that they had this problem. I spoke to the only professor of paediatrics in Sydney at the time. He was unaware that anyone else had this problem. I spoke to state and Commonwealth health departments. They told me that I was Robinson Crusoe. On one infamous occasion, when I was almost crying at the feet of Sydney's leading paediatrician, begging him to investigate and provide me with some information, he looked at me for a few seconds and said, "Dr. Kalokerinos, you're not really suitable to be practicing medicine in a remote area." He said, "You're overstressed." And then he went on to suggest that perhaps I should see a psychiatrist. In actual fact, I found out later that this problem with infant deaths, particularly Aboriginal infant deaths, was right across Australia. In fact, it was far, far worse in some parts of Australia than it was in Kalokerinos. Now, this is a very, very important issue. Something can be very obvious. I mean, what could be more obvious than a dead kid? Can be extremely serious, and its existence not only be ignored, but denied. And unless this is understood, it is impossible to understand what my problem was. Now, I knew that these other places were having infant deaths too. Yet when I spoke to doctors, their response was almost universally hostile. So I was left to handle the problem by myself. As the years went by, and a whole lot of coffins were taken out to the cemetery, tiny coffins, I observed one important thing, and that was that infants that died in these strange ways had not been totally healthy before death. They had all gone through a period since birth almost, shortly after birth, of having multiple minor infections. And the most outstanding one was acute otitis media, acute sore ears. One attack after the other, requiring treatment. Or recurrent colds, mild gastrointestinal disturbances, bit of diarrhea but not very much, not the sort of things that you would be particularly concerned about. But they're almost never free of some sort of a problem. And I couldn't understand why this was going on. With the Aboriginal kids, the running noses were obvious. Their bowel motion smelt vile. And the nurses, who had to change their nappies, would screw up their noses. And they all thought, and even I thought, that this was a particular characteristic of Aboriginal babies. They just stunk. And of course, years later, I found out that that smell was due to gastrointestinal problems. It was a combination of inability to properly digest food, abnormal bacteria, abnormal viruses, intestinal parasites, and broken down red cells from minute hemorrhages that occurred in little parts of the gut. But that was later. So from 1957, 58, 59, 60, 61 and 62, there's almost a continuous procession of tiny coffins out to the cemetery. In 1962 was when I realised that it was multiple minor infections that preceded the death. And this coincided with the arrival in the base hospital in a town called Tamworth, which was our centre, 250 miles away, of the first specialist physician. He's a bright young man by the name of Douglas Harbison. And it immediately became obvious to me that he was a man with extreme talents. So I thought, well, I'll send him one of these kids that's going through the stage of multiple minor infections and see what he thinks. So I just picked one of the kids out of the hat, more or less. And I sent him down. Douglas must have examined him with a microscope, because he observed the roots of some of the hairs, not all of them of course, just a few here and there, little minute hemorrhagic spots like little bruises. And he thought to himself, now what can cause that? The only thing that he was aware of was scurvy. So he gave this little boy an injection of vitamin C. A few days later sent him back to Kalokerinos with a note, a letter that I still have. And when I read this letter, I was confused. Because how could it be scurvy? I had been supplementing that little boy with more than the recommended daily allowances of all the vitamins for months. And any 5-year-old at school could tell you that a few lousy milligrams of vitamin C every day prevents scurvy. So how could he have scurvy? So I thought, well, maybe Dr. Harbison is not as clever as I thought he was. But it went in there and kept going round and round in my head. But I thought, no, it's not scurvy. But I did notice that there was a dramatic change in that little boy's appearance and in his behaviour. He was different, more like a normal child, whereas before he was a bit grisly and not real happy and miserable. Not a lot, but just. And that bothered me. So 1962, 63, 64, more deaths. I did notice in a few that before they died, they had a degree of liver tenderness and liver pain. I'd feel gently over the liver and they would react. It hurt. I sent specimens of these livers and other tissues down to the government laboratories in Sydney. And the reports came back suggesting that everything was okay. But there were minor changes in some of these livers, minor fatty changes. They call it steatosis, which I think is a Greek word for fat. And when I asked the authorities what that signified, they said, oh, it's okay, it's normal, it's nothing. I said, but it's only these kids that die that show that, not the others. And they said, it's nothing. I couldn't accept it. But I was never given an explanation. I sent blood samples away for checking. And the reports came back iron deficiency anemia. So I rang the top specialist in Sydney and asked his advice, and he said they need iron. So I fed iron to these kids, made them worse, not better. Didn't improve their anemias. And it was only a slight anemia. So I rang up this top specialist again, and he said they probably have to have it by injection. So I started to give these kids iron injections, and I had to stop very quickly. I got some alarming responses. I sent bowel motions down to the laboratories, expecting to get reports back that they're abnormal organisms and parasites and so on. The reports came back, they were all clear. I prepared those samples according to instructions. I sent them down to the laboratories according to instructions. And although I was mystified and concerned, it appeared that there were no gastrointestinal problems present. But I was wrong. Years later, I found out that although I was told that the method of transportation was correct, in fact it wasn't. So by the time the specimens got down to Sydney, any abnormal wogs in them and all the parasites had been destroyed. I didn't find that out until years later. So at the end of 1964, I became virtually totally disillusioned. I was getting nowhere. I was getting no cooperation. As far as I was concerned, a junior nurse could have been doing the work that I was doing. And this corresponded with a meeting with a young Greek boy named Peter Christianos. And he told me his name, and he told me then that his father had just found £3 million worth of opal in a place called Kalokerinos in Central Australia. And I thought, that can't be true. Nobody ever finds £3 million worth of opal. But it was true. His father had come out to Australia with his family of young boys, and he'd read sometime when he was young about the gold fields in Australia. So he thought, well, I'll go and dig for gold. And in fact, he was a remarkably intelligent man. So he set about this in the correct way. He went to the mines department in Adelaide. He could hardly speak English, but they were able to explain to him that the days of gold mining were over. But they said to him, there's a place called Kalokerinos, 600 mile up the track, Central Australia. And people are finding opal there. Perhaps you should forget about the gold and go and mine for opal. So that's what he did. After he was there for a little while, he found 2,000 pounds worth of opal. I think it was 20,000 pounds worth of opal. Just good luck. And then a new field was discovered, the famous 8 Mile field, Kalokerinos. And there's a rush to peg claims. And he joined the rush. And he pegged one particular claim. It was only a little area of ground surrounded by other claims, going right under the Alice Springs Road. But he didn't understand mining. He started a shaft, and it went down through a type of rock which is known never to contain opal. I mean, you may as well go and try and find opal in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, because it just doesn't produce opal. But he didn't know that. And he couldn't speak English. He was the only Greek on the field. But one of the Australian miners tried to advise him. They said to him, look, you're wasting your time here, that's not opal bearing. But he didn't trust him, so he kept on going. And after he got down, I think it was about 45 feet, I can't remember exactly, he started to make a horizontal drive. Nothing. So he came back in the opposite direction and made a drive the other way. Nothing. So he came back to where he started and made a third drive in the shape of a T with the others. And after going just a few feet, he struck a fault in the rocks. And in that fault there was 2,000 pounds worth of opal, just in an area, say 6 foot by 6 foot. But he kept on going, and there was nothing. So an Australian miner came down to advise him, and he told him that maybe the level of opal was just above his head. He said to him, have a look up in the roof. So on this famous day they brought down the roof, literally. On the first day, they found a 12-gallon bucket full of opal. Go into an opal dealer and see how much it costs to buy a tiny stone that you can hardly see. And imagine you've got a 12-gallon bucket full. There wasn't even 10 ounces of dirt in that bucket. It came out clean with just a very thin orange skin. It was a huge find. Now, one of his sons, Peter, who I met, was a bit of a playboy, so his father temporarily disinherited him. And Peter said to his father, I don't care, I'll go and find my own. So he came over to New South Wales to the town of Lightning Ridge, which was just a short distance from Kalokerinos, where the famous black opal is found. But he didn't find anything. But he teamed up with a young Greek boy in the town of Kalokerinos, whose father was my father's next door neighbour in Greece, just a sheer coincidence, Bill Petrahilis. And he talked Bill into going to Cooper Pedy with him.
Excuse me.
Okay, we'll stop
Sorry.
for a second.
Yes.
Okay, we're rolling.
Let me just double check. See if this is. Tell us more.
Well, in Kalokerinos, there was a man, Manuel Petrohelis, who was my father's next door neighbour in Greece. Actual next door neighbour. And he had a son, Bill. And Bill became friendly with Peter Christianus, the son of Mr. Christianus, of course. And Peter Christianus talked Bill into going to Cooper Pedy with him to look for opal. So off they went. They worked for 3 months and found nothing. And Bill became disillusioned and returned to Kalokerinos. But his father and I more or less made him go back against his wishes. And to make sure that he went back, his father drove him in the family car all those thousands of miles. And eventually they arrived in Cooper Pedy and found out where Peter Christianus was living and drove out to the field, and Peter recognised the car. And when he saw it, he came running towards him, waving his arms and yelling, "We found it, we found it." He had found something quite extraordinary. 6 levels, one on top of the other, separated by 6 to 8 feet, of the most magnificent quality opal that anyone has ever seen. It wasn't black opal, which is the most precious, that only occurs at Lightning Ridge, but it was crystal, which has to be seen to be understood. He didn't dig out pieces the size of house bricks like his father did, but he dug out pieces the size of a packet of cigarettes, and a lot of it. He didn't dig out a 12-gallon bucket full every day like his father did, but he dug out a plastic bucket full almost every day. It still remains perhaps as the best quality opal that's ever been found in Cooper Pedy. So of course I saw all these riches. Opal in those days was sold in a very simple way. It would be stacked up in heaps according to its quality on the table. An opal buyer would turn up, and if he agreed on the price, he would empty a suitcase full of money onto one end of the table and scoop the opal into the suitcase, shake hands and have a cup of coffee, and that was that. The money was never really counted. It was still in his bank wrappers. Everyone just took each other's words for it. And once or twice Bill came back to Kalokerinos and he showed me some of the opal. He told me about all this money. Well, it was too much for me. I decided that I would throw up medicine forever and become an opal miner.
Hold on 1 second.
Where'd you go?
That is odd. That's nice and clean, so I know that's clean. It's, this is the
Why don't you leave it on
lock,
too?
right?
So if you're getting close, Russell, you'll know.
Oh, so this is the Sennheiser?
Yeah.
Turn it up on the, where's the receiver of the Sennheiser?
It's right over here.
Oh.
I'm getting good levels.
Well, no, I've got a problem on it. Throw off medicine, become an opal miner.
I did, but first I need to go to Cooper Pedy and see if it was a feasible proposition. And I flew over there. Now I had an advantage of having an education, and I could count up to 10. So I counted all the opal miners on the field, and then I counted the numbers that had struck it rich. And it turned out that almost every second miner struck it rich. And when I say struck it rich, I mean a lot. You know, they were about £100,000, which is equivalent to $200,000. But this is going back, of course, to the 1960s, when that was a lot of money. So I thought, this is a crazy situation. All you have to do is go to Cooper Pedy, you dig a hole in the ground, you've got 1 chance in 2 of striking it rich. So Bill and I decided we would form a partnership with 2 other young Greeks in Cooper Pedy. But it took me 6 months to organise my affairs and wait for the worst of the hot summer to pass. But when I arrived in Cooper Pedy, I got a bit of a shock, because the reason why every second miner had struck it rich during my first visit was because a new field had been discovered and it was extremely rich. So every second shaft bottomed on opal. But by the time I got there, that field had been worked out and no new field had been discovered.